Chapter 4, Part 4, Moral Reasoning. The objectives for this video begin with us identifying a common pattern of moral reasoning. Then we're going to learn how this pattern of moral reasoning works by applying it to the story about Sandra and Jose. Then we're going to discover what we do when we're met with moral conflicts, learn a number of foundational moral principles, and discover a process for arriving at derived moral principles from foundational moral principles. So to begin, I'm going to lay out our strategy. All moral claims should ultimately be derivable from some set of foundational values, whether these values are moral or non-moral. This is what most ethical theories are attempting to show. They're attempting to show what foundational claims all other moral claims are derived from. But to best understand this, we need to understand moral reasoning. Although people engage in moral reasoning all the time, it's going to help us to explicitly lay out a reasoning pattern people follow when they reason morally. Understanding the pattern of moral reasoning is going to equip us to understand how moral theories work. And in the next chapter, we're going to start looking at our first sets of moral theories and then spend the rest of the class going through moral theories. So, understanding how moral theories work by having a good grasp on moral reasoning is going to be very helpful. All right, moral reasoning. The pattern for moral reasoning is this. You begin with a principle and then add a descriptive claim, and then you end up with a moral judgment. If you don't understand what that means, that's okay. We're going to be talking about it quite a bit in the next few minutes. All right, let's look at Sandra's moral reasoning with a principle about the value of life. Now remember, we start with a principle, then a descriptive claim, and we follow this up with a moral judgment. So the principle, a human life is a great moral good. Then the descriptive claim, my reporting Jose could later endanger his life. And this leads to the moral judgment. So I shouldn't endanger Jose's life by reporting him. Then on the other side of the conflict, we can see Sandra's moral reasoning when she starts with a principle about dishonesty. Remember, we're going to begin with a principle, then a descriptive claim, and then end up with a moral judgment. So, the principle, no one should lie or deceive others. And then the descriptive claim, by not reporting Jose on the form, I would be deceiving others. And so we end with the moral judgment. Thus, I ought to report Jose. All right. Now, to break this down a little bit more. So, to begin the process of moral reasoning, we start with a principle that's expressed as a generalization and that's intended to hold universally. Now remember from the previous video that a characteristic of moral claims is that they're universalizable. So our principle is universalizable, like any moral claim should be. In this case, the principle that we're looking at is a value claim. A human life is a great moral good. So you begin the process with a principle. In this case, the principle that a human life is a great moral good. Then we move on to a descriptive claim that's added to relate the principle to a certain or current situation. So, in this case, the descriptive claim relates the principle, a human life is a great moral good, to the particular situation that Sandra's in. My or Sandra's reporting Jose could later endanger his life. All right. So when we have those two things together, we end up with a moral judgment. The principle and this descriptive claim allow us to identify what this moral judgment is. So I shouldn't endanger Jose's life by reporting him. All right. Now, let's go through the claims on the other side of the dilemma. We'll start again with a principle that's expressed as a generalization and that's intended to hold universally. In this case, the principle is a prescriptive claim. No one should lie or deceive others. We move on from here to the descriptive claim. Remember that the descriptive claim is the claim that relates the principle to the current situation. By not reporting Jose on the form, I would be deceiving others. This is a descriptive claim. And then, as before, we move on to the moral judgment. Thus, I ought to report Jose. The principle and the descriptive claim together allow us to identify what the moral judgment's going to be. All right, but what are we supposed to do now in Sandra's situation? We've clearly identified how moral judgments work, but she's still met with a moral conflict. Well, our analysis of Sandra's moral reasoning shows us that Sandra's met with conflicting moral judgments, as we all realize. But how do we resolve these conflicts? Well, one way is to suppose that there's another moral principle that asserts that protecting a human life is more important than telling the truth. So this new principle can allow us to make some progress. Okay, so here's Sandra's moral reasoning with this new principle that protecting a human life is more important than telling the truth. So, it's morally more important to protect someone's life from danger than to tell the truth. This is the principle that we're beginning with. My situation forces me to either endanger Jose's life by telling the truth, or to protect his life by lying. This is the descriptive claim. Remember, the descriptive claim moves you from the principle to the situation that you're currently in. And then we end up with our moral judgment. Thus, it's right in this situation to lie about Jose to protect his life. All right. Again, we begin with a principle, which in this case is a moral principle that's designed to help ease the tension between the moral conflict. We add the descriptive claim that moves from a generalizable claim to our particular situation, and we end with our moral judgment. All right. Moving on to foundational principles. We're looking at this pattern of moral reasoning, both to give us insight into our own moral reasoning, but also to help us better understand how moral theories work. Most moral theories, as I said, begin with a foundational moral principle and use this principle to derive other moral principles that help us know what we're supposed to do in any particular situation. We can use a very similar pattern to the one that we've just gone through to derive other principles from foundational moral principles. So you may be wondering what a foundational moral principle is. So here are three. The first one is that one should always do what promotes the greatest amount of overall happiness. The second moral principle, we should never treat persons as mere means to achieve our own ends. And the third, we should act towards others the same way we'd like them to act towards us. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to have the opportunity to look at moral systems based on each of these foundational moral principles. So keep them in the back of your mind because they're going to come up again. All right. Now, how do we move from a foundational principle to a derived principle? Well, we're going to use a pattern that's very similar to our pattern of moral reasoning. We start with a foundational principle, we add a descriptive claim, and we end up at a derived principle. So here's an example of how this works. One should do what best promotes overall happiness. Remember, this is our foundational principle. Taking others' things produces more pain than happiness. This is our descriptive claim. As before, the descriptive claim moves us from a more generalizable foundational principle to something more specific. And then we end up at our derived principle. No one should take what belongs to another. Here's another example. The foundational principle is never treat people as mere means to achieve your ends. Lying treats another person as merely a means to get something that we want, so we shouldn't lie. Okay, to review, here are some questions that you should be able to answer. What's the common pattern of moral reasoning that was introduced in this chapter? How did this pattern of moral reasoning apply to the story about Sandra and Jose? What does this analysis suggest we do when we're met with a moral conflict? What are the 3 foundational moral principles mentioned in this chapter? And explain the process for arriving at derived moral principles from foundational moral principles.